Hey guys, Shane here. So welcome to this tutorial video. We're going to be taking a look at airbrushing Tamiya acrylics. So Tamiya has a bit of a reputation of being a very difficult color to airbrush, requiring a lot of very refined tinning. However, it is not as difficult as the reputation will have us believe. So I've pre-primed our test piece here, which is Tamiya's recent release of their Goliath demolition mine, and I've just used their rattle can primer. Now again, priming is not to everyone's taste. I always prefer to prime. It just gives me a solid and even coat to lay my paint on, and I always feel as the more control you have over your workpiece, the better your end results are. There's less things that can go wrong the more work you put down before you start laying paint, if you understand what I mean. So in order to do our tinning work, we're going to be using their X28 thinner. They do have a lacquer thinner as well, however that is a very difficult product to find here in Ireland. So before we go on to tinning our paints, firstly I would recommend shaking and mixing our paints quite thoroughly to ensure that all the pigments are mixed together well. Again, it's all about just pairing our paints and thinner before we start doing our spray work to avoid disaster later on. So with both of our paints thoroughly mixed together, now I'm going to start mixing them. And for this, I'm going to use a very simple and secret weapon, if you like, which is a plastic shot glass. So we're going to be doing all of our mixing and tinning using shot glasses for each colour. And this allows us to control visually our mixing ratio. It makes life much easier. Also, again, optional if you want, you can use a pipette to get very refined and very accurate mixtures of paint. I tend to do it by eye, but for a beginner, I would recommend using a pipette so you can just keep note of how much paint to thinner ratio you're putting in. So I'm just going to take some dark yellow and some deck brown to make like a sandy brown colour. As you can see here, I'm just using a piece of stick to act as a guide because I tend to do most of my mixing by eye. And I'm going to make this a very basic sandy brown colour to act as a base tone for a Dunkelgelb layer. So with our paint mixed together, now it's going to be time to start adding our thinner, which is the part that tends to scare people the most. The thing to bear in mind with Tamiya paints is you're really going for 70 to 80% thinner to paint. I find 70% to be the sweet spot, so basically 3 parts thinner for 1 part paint. That's what I'd recommend. And by using these shot glasses, we can visually see the mass, if you like, the viscosity of the paint, which I can barely say that word, and we can see just how well it's starting to thin out. If it's too thick, again, we can just add more thinner. If it's too thin, we can always add a few drops of paint. And because we can actually see what we're doing, we can give and take as we need. Also, another very simple visual cue to see how well your paint is thinned is just to take a small scrap piece of paper towel or the underside of a model and see, can you draw fine pencil lines. Now the airbrush I'm using is a Hardron Steenbeck Evolution CR Plus with a 1.5mm needle, and my air pressure is about 15 psi. I find this works quite well. You can go higher with it, but you kind of want relatively low pressures on your airbrush. Now what I find with Tamiya paints while you airbrush them is you must put it down in very light coats. So keep the airbrush moving, it being a double action airbrush, so I'm only pulling back on the paint ever so slightly. There's only a very small amount of paint coming out of the airbrush. It's mostly just air. And you can see I just keep moving around the model. I don't let it build up, because you will see here there's times I almost start pooling paint onto the model, and it's very easy to do that with Tamiya, especially when it's this heavily tinned. So that would be the biggest thing to bear in mind, is just to ensure that you keep as little paint out of the airbrush as possible and keep your subject moving. So again, I'm just going to just take some standard deck brown, and we're just going to we're going to go through the tinning process all over again. So again, I'm just adding about 70% thinner, so you can see me adding quite a bit of thinner to paint. And then I just start slowly mixing it up. And you can see that I keep rocking the glass. People often talk about tinning Tamiya to a milky consistency, which is a little bit of a fake concept, but really what they're meaning is you want a density that's not that of water nor of a syrup. So you want something that's got a bit of mass to it, but still flows quite easily. And by basically using the shot glass, you can catch your stirring stick, catch a bit of paint that you're just currently tinning out, and pull it up alongside pull it up the walls of the glass and see how well it flows. If it flows back down into the cup again, you know you've tinted quite correctly. And again, I'm just doing a little bit of a spray test here. Now this is a little bit too thick, so I've just added a drop or two of X20 back into my mixture. And that's a beautiful thing of doing all your mixing out of the airbrush itself, because you can take and add as you need to. So now moving on to our more proper Dunkelgelb layer. So we're going to be using what, X60 and X17-9, I believe. Can't quite see from this angle. So this is a very light color, and I'm going to run into a bit of trouble with this, and I'll talk us through it properly in a moment. So again, I'm adding 3 parts thinner to 1 part paint, if you like, and I want it to be quite thin. So always just tin it slightly heavier than you normally would a normal paint, and that's always the best way to go. And again, I'm not too happy with it, so I'll just come back, add another little few drops of thinner, and just mix it up. And I just keep taking or adding paint to thinner as I need to. So you can kind of see that kind of milky consistency. You know, it doesn't look like a water. You know, it's a little bit thicker than that type of density. You know, it's actually kind of a difficult concept to explain, but I hope it kind of comes across. Now I run into a strange little quirk here of using this light sandy color for my Dunkelgelb, and that is that it kind of dazzles me under the lighting I have. So I'll actually will end up pooling some of the paint a little bit heavily on some of the surfaces here. You can kind of see it in places where it'll just ever so slightly puddle a little bit on some of the surfaces. Now the trick here is just to leave it alone. Don't touch it, don't try to wipe it away. It looks a lot worse than it actually is, especially if you're just applying a tiny amount of paint at a time. Just allow it to dry and come back and put 1 or 2 very light coats of the same paint color over it, just to blend it in. Bearing in mind our paint is quite thin, it has a slight self-leveling element to it, so just allow it to dry and you can always come back and then just blend it back in that way, rather than if you panic and try to undo that puddle with more paint in that moment, you will destroy the surface of the model. So again, just a tiny amount of paint, keep your surface moving so you're not pooling that much paint onto one area, and it's very easy to do that. And especially with lighter colors like this, with the lighting I'm using, sometimes you can't actually see where your paint is going. It kind of dazzles you, so you only begin to notice it as you start getting that slight puddle effect on the surface of your model. So I'm just going to talk very quickly about using Tamiya's clear colors. Now this is immensely thick pigment. As you can see here, it's almost like a syrup. So I tin this out very heavily, about 85% thinner to remainder, about almost like 15% pigment or paint. It is such a thick color, so you can see I put a massive amount of thinner into it, and so I'm just creating this to create like a blending tint, so I don't want it too thick. So you can see I almost just made like a filter out of it, but this is a very thick color, so I would recommend tinning it quite heavily before you apply it to your model. And again, I'm just keeping my PSI to 15%. I am applying quite a bit of the clear paint, but again, I'm being very careful not to flood the surface of the model with too much color at once, especially such a heavily tinned color as this shade here. So guys, I really hope you found this very basic tutorial on Tamiya colors of help to you. It's not a difficult color to use, but once you keep it a relatively high percentage of thinner to paint, you should be absolutely fine, and these paints will not fight with you too much, and the end result that you get with Tamiya colors are fantastic. So guys, thank you so much for watching. I know this has been a pretty quick tutorial, but this Goliath will feature in a much longer feature-length painting tutorial, complete with a US Navy driver, based on a very famous photograph from D-Day. So guys, do tune in next week when we work on that full painting tutorial. I have been Shane, thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video. Bye bye.